Hello and welcome to the Colts Cover-2 podcast. I am Joel A. Erickson. I am joined, as always, by Nate Atkins. We had probably different plans, or we hadn't figured out what our plans were for this week's podcast until Wednesday night when the news broke. The Colts broke the news themselves that the team's owner, Jim Irsay, had died peacefully in his sleep on Wednesday afternoon. I was thinking about this. There's only a few people now who can say that they've been a part of an organization for essentially its entire time. And I know the Colts were around before they moved to Indianapolis, but like Jim Irsay was a part of this Colts team for all of its time in Indianapolis. Now I know he wasn't the owner until his dad's stroke, but he was inexorably tied to the operations of the Colts as general manager. It was a lot like Stephen Jones with the Dallas Cowboys. Like he's part of the fabric of the decision-making process. He is the Colts in Indianapolis, you know. He grew up with the Baltimore Colts, but so that was always a part of his stories. But he is Indianapolis. He is the Colts in Indianapolis. He's football in Indianapolis, in a way that really nobody else is. You know, Peyton Manning is the most responsible for that. Or is the most responsible for this team, you know, kind of flipping the basketball and football interest around and making it a football town. But Manning has, games played in Denver and a Super Bowl won in Denver, and he wasn't there for the first, decade and a half that the organization was in Indianapolis. Irsay has been a part of all of it, and I think that's sort of the first thing that struck me is just the seismic nature of sort of losing that pillar, the foundational pillar of the team in Indianapolis, in a way that it has to be jarring. I think it feels jarring for us. It probably feels jarring for people who've been here since 1984 and have followed the Colts since 1984. It has to be very jarring because he's always been a part of it, and suddenly he's not.
Yeah, and Stephen Jones is an interesting comparison, but it's as if we saw like Stephen Jones's life play out, because we saw Jim Irsay. I say we, the city of Indianapolis, saw Jim Irsay's rise. I mean, if you go back, especially take it back to just the existence of the Colts, back to the Baltimore Colts days, you're going from a kid who'd follow his dad to Colts practices. He was a kid who was a ball boy. He's lifting with the players. Then he becomes later on the general manager. He's kind of this young general manager thrust into that role of actually running the team. Whereas in Dallas, it's going to be Jerry Jones doing it until it's Stephen Jones, and then. So he had a long run as a general manager, and then 2.5 decade run as the sole owner, and we kind of got to see the entire evolution. And so this franchise is him in that way, and it feels seismic because obviously it's literally seismic in the fact that they'll have a new owner, they'll have a new face, they'll have change in power and all that kind of stuff. But the entire identity and personality of the franchise has been Jim Irsay. I think when you think about their existence in Indianapolis, it has been a very interesting mix of highs and lows, of long periods of great success and some drawn out periods of not having that. And so, but in Peyton Manning was the peak of that. That was obviously when they won the Super Bowl and got to another, but they had their run with Andrew Luck as well. So they've had a couple of those, and then they've had some stretches, pre Peyton Manning and post Andrew Luck that have not matched that. And I think Jim Irsay, everything about him has kind of manifested itself in how this team has worked. Is that sometimes he was sometimes he's too much. He's over the top in terms of how he's run the team and put himself out there. Sometimes that energy and passion and activity has really worked to have an owner who really knew football on a football level and kind of kept that football obsession at the heart of it. Like there was never a question of whether he kind of loved this team and loved this city and loved being like the scene in Indianapolis. And they kind of had a window for that at a certain moment where they were the new franchise in town in the 80s. I know it took a while for the city to embrace them because they were new. It's a basketball state. They were really bad for a while there, but then they really hit their window when, especially post Pacers brawl and some of the changes with that franchise where the Peyton Manning, Andrew Luck era was able to kind of take the city back in that way. And it's just interesting to think about like that run is finally at its end. And, he's just in my short time being here, I feel like I've gotten to see some different moments in Irsay, different times of him. There's the times when he was, as involved as any owner in football, and not in always great ways with the Jonathan Taylor contract negotiations and some of the quarterback benchings. There are times that he was as involved as ever in great ways with the league in terms of getting Dan Snyder out of ownership and making positive changes for the shape of the league. And then there's sort of the disappearance and the unknowns of the past year and a half or so that have ultimately foreshadowed what the tragic news that came out yesterday with him passing. But it still kind of comes. It's one of those like it's true anytime you lose somebody, even when it's going to happen or that it's unsurprising that it happens, it still can be a jolt when it does happen because not only is someone not here anymore, but there's a total void of whatever that person was before. And for Irsay, that was so many things between, a face of the league, a total figure in Indianapolis, a hands-on football owner, a philanthropist, a musician, everything he decided to be that owners usually don't have that kind of front-facing role. You think about like cross football, I feel like over the past, let's say 2 decades, I feel like you can add anyone to this if you can think of one, but I feel like there have been 4 owners that have been so really in the spotlight, the owners you really think about of having either power, influence, or voices. And that's Jim Irsay, Jerry Jones, Robert Kraft, and Dan Snyder. And Irsay took down Dan Snyder for the league, so that then became a group of 3, and now it's down to 2. It's just sort of like it's seismic within Indianapolis, and then it's also seismic within the NFL just because of Irsay's role with it, the things he's said and done, and the way the Colts have fit in their move from Baltimore to Indianapolis. Like this is just a big time news event that like when it even though it was obviously someday it was going to come, but when it did come, it was definitely big.
The only one I would add is maybe Jeff Lurie in Philly. As
getting there lately too.
Yeah, it's especially lately, and also because his role is he's kind of become known as the owner, as like the poster boy owner. Mm-hmm. So I might add him. I think one of the things with Irsay is just, and I hesitate to. I've covered the Colts now for 7 seasons. This will be my 8th season covering them, but I really came on the beat at a time when Irsay had established relationships with most of the other main writers on the beat, and some of those people have moved on, some of them have not. But it means that I don't necessarily have the insight personally that some of those people do. I obviously spoke to them. I covered their team, but I don't know that I have. I don't know that it's my place necessarily to offer. I think that there are some people who can offer some insight into the man behind the public stuff he said. I just don't think that I'm really in that place. What I do think has stuck out to me over the last, we're taping this on Thursday afternoon, so almost a full day now since the news broke. I think one of the things that sticks out to me is just the response from so many different people. And there's one in particular that came out today that I think kind of typifies what's really been pressed on me over the last day or so. It's just so Eric Burkhart, who's an NFL agent. I don't think most fans would know his name. He's been around a long time. He tweeted a thread about Irsay, and one of Burkhart's players lost somebody close to them, and Irsay offered to pay for the funeral. Burkhart told them, you don't have to do that, and Irsay sort of insisted that he do that for the family. And in the course of that, Burkhart learned that that Irsay has done that for lots and lots and lots and lots and lots. The number is enormous of people. I think that's the thing that sticks out to me. There's been other stories that people have told about just all of the we knew about all of the. There's a lot of the giving that we knew about, and apparently there's a lot of the giving we didn't know about. And I think that's one of the things that's sticking out to me is just how many people he found a way to touch in dark moments or pressed in, even when they were at their. Ryan Kelly is another one who mentioned who posted something about the way Irsay responded to the loss of their daughter, and what they went through with his sons when they were born. There's dozens of stories like that I've seen, I've read or heard since then. And I think that's one of the things that's pressed on me is just you knew that he had diverse interests as a philanthropist and as a giver. I think some of the individual stuff beyond the players, working with his employees, what he's done for Colts employees over the years who aren't players, also is really stands out just in terms of his nature and his desire to help in whatever way he could.
Yeah, I think the intentionality of his giving over the years is stood out to me. I mean, there's a lot of people, billionaires, especially owners, that will do some versions of philanthropy, and any kind of giving is certainly nice. It's nice when a lot of everyday people get helped out, whether it's schools, sports teams, police and fire, whatever it is. But it seemed like Jim Irsay very often he was either reaching people in dark places like you talked about, or kind of opening the door to prevent darkness from spreading. So a lot of the mental health initiatives, a lot of what he pumped into the Indiana, the IU Medical Center, for example, a lot of that had intentionality behind it. Even stuff that you might, think is it's just very different for an owner to be into. I mean, there was the story about him trying to ship the whale to safe harbor, and it's so much money, it's $20 million. And of course, the timing was tough on that with the Jonathan Taylor's contract standoff. But that's another small example of a guy who loved animals and saw a dire situation and wanted to do something to save a dire situation. And that's what a lot of them were, is that this is a guy who, one of the rare owners in sports and billionaires in this country that have been to very, very, very low lows, and sometimes prolonged lows, sometimes some near-death experience type situations. So he's actually gotten to kind of feel that pain in ways that other owners and billionaires just are never going to feel in touch with. And I wrote about this in the story I put out today on Jim Irsay, but it's not to say that he was always like perfectly in touch. There certainly have been sound bites over the years for this highly accessible man that have been very out of touch. When he, some of the famous ones when he talked about, Jonathan Taylor comparing their privilege and talking about, if I die tonight and Jonathan Taylor's out of the league, no one will miss us. There was the rich white billionaire comment about Carmel police. To me, what that ultimately showed, though, is how impossible of a task he was trying to take under, which is being relatable in a place of being an older billionaire who's been born into this. It's like the wealth and the power is the only thing he's ever known. But he tried in everything. He put himself into everything, and that included, I think, those levels of empathy that then spread into the generosity and intentional giving. And like you, I have covered this team for 3.5 seasons, so I have much less time with Irsay than most of those people. And I came in even more in the time when he had established relationships. So I don't have a lot of these moments that are different than what someone else would have. But I did have one as in his office that I wrote about in that piece that's always kind of stood out to me, because we've always known about Jim Irsay's love of music and collecting artifacts. And when you just kind of look at it from a distance, you hear that just kind of sounds like, a guy who's got money and whatever that he wants to spend on guitars. What does that really matter? Well, the day that I was in his office, though, was when he was helping start an auction for to sell off Kurt Cobain's guitar from the music video "Smells Like Teen Spirit." And of course, we know Kurt Cobain's story was this uber talented musician who's ultimately succumbed to those demons of drugs and alcohol and mental health issues, and took his own life. And he sat there with that guitar that he used in his brightest moments to play to play that song that everyone knows about. And he starts off the donation with $2 million, and that had come right after it was during Mental Health Awareness Month, which is May, and I think it's a fitting time for Jim Irsay to pass in Mental Health Awareness Month. But it was May at the time, and that's kind of what the initiative was about. But it was also like 2 weeks after Shaquille Leonard had come out and been super open about his mental health and getting into dark places that nobody knew about. And so I remember asking Jim Irsay about how he has a lot of star players who are willing to do that. And his answer about that and the way he answered it, and just some of our interaction after when he thanked me for asking that, showed like that's one of the moments that he's most proud of, is that culture and those doors that he opened with conversation. And I just don't know that a lot of owners identify or think that way, that's what they want to get out of this life, that's what they want to get out of owning a team. And at times those diverse interests and experiences of his life, you could say, took away a little bit from the cutthroat nature of football and what all they were putting into signing people. And this wasn't his only thing as the on-field product, even though he loved this team. But it was like, that's what ultimately to me is going to be his legacy moving forward, is that he ran this team in his way that was at times crazy and eccentric, at times very dialed in and passionate. But he did it in a way I have a hard time comparing really to any owner who's at least done it for as long as he has. And so I'll always kind of remember that moment of him beaming with that guitar, because I finally kind of understood it on a deeper level, that this is more than just a love of music and whatnot, that it's kind of like a heartfelt and beautiful gateway for him into some of the pain that people experience, and his way of preserving history and also kind of opening up doors for the future too.
From a football standpoint, I think the thing that I'm going to remember most is he was an NFL history nerd. I I think, it's easy to think of all NFL owners as kind of being that way, but not like Irsay, not where, he would pepper his stories with comparisons of, Colts players or other players around the league to the greats of the game from the 70s and the 60s and, even the 50s. He had such an extensive knowledge. His whole life was spent in the NFL, but there are other people who have spent their entire lives in the NFL in an ownership capacity who don't talk the same way. He really deeply cared about the NFL. In a way that, I don't know, it felt like when I was a kid, I read every history book the Stanley Public Library had on the history of football and the history of basketball and the history of baseball. And they're all, full of stories about these Hall of Famers and, their impact on the game and everything like that. And you're getting this download of the stuff. It felt like Irsay carried one of those books around in his head about the NFL. And he was always ready to access it. And I think that's one of the things that sticks out to me. It's just he really deeply cared about the history of the game, the role of the NFL, or what the league, what he thought the league should be, and that's another thing that's kind of fun to have. I think for a fan base to have in an owner, a lot of owners feel like their interest, for better or worse, it feels like their interest is partially economic, partially hands off. You don't get that feeling from a lot of owners that they really, really, really love the game. Jim Irsay really, really, really loved football, and he really loved the NFL in ways that I can't really think of. And I've only covered 2 teams, so I haven't had like conversations with some of the owners we mentioned earlier who are public. But like I said, he had a encyclopedic knowledge of the greats of the game and who they were, and that piece of him is a neat thing to have in an owner.
It's rare because most of the people that rise to this rare space of even dreaming of buying a team did so through means that have nothing to do with football. And so this to them is another business venture. And it's something they kind of come into sometimes later in their life. Obviously, there's families that pass it down, which is how Jim Irsay, acquired his, that maybe it's a little bit more ingrained within them. But it's those, even a lot of those owners aren't people who played football who then become a general manager before they're an owner. So you think about across the league, just trying to think through this of other owners that have anything close to this. And it's Jerry Jones is the one that certainly comes to mind, who is the general manager and the owner, clearly is football obsessed. But beyond that, I feel like there's a few who you can tell know the game on a more than just a basic owner level. Jeffrey Lurie and Robert Kraft kind of come to mind. There's some that I think want to know the game more than they do, like maybe a Jimmy Haslam, who just kind of stepped into this and tried to teach himself how to be an expert. But it's like, it's different. It's hard to find the actual balance that Irsay had, where like he spent 65 years on this earth and all 65 were like loving football and trying to play it and trying to be that at the time. And, when it didn't work out for him as a player, becoming, a world champion, or just in terms of like all of us, his playing days had to end before you get to the pros. He becomes a world championship competing weightlifter, and he's just all involved in a way on the football level that owners just often aren't. And I think for a lot of his time that was beneficial to have that, because you also had an owner who is a front-facing member of the league that is making decisions that are also with football intent behind them. And a lot of what happens is then the owners, they gather together in these owners meetings and they work out the CBA. They are working things out in terms of, what they're looking for is power, and they're looking for, control, and they're looking for things that, and that's what owners generally do. But I don't know that all of them look at actually trying to kind of improve the product of the game and look out for the product and get close to the individual players. I've covered 2 other teams, and this is different because these were owned by women who were already in their 90s at the times, with the Bears and the Lions. But even though those would be visible owners, they'd be around the team, they'd say hi, they'd speak to the team. I don't feel like it's rare to find. Jim Irsay is a owner I've been around that players felt like they actually knew the man and they could talk football with him. And I think you saw that in some of the interaction, less so in the last couple of years because of obviously the state he's gotten into. But like, you go back to just the bond that I saw him at the very tail end of his time with T.Y. Hilton was very. They would sit there and they'd go through like where the team was, and TY's, a very smart, introspective player, and they would go back and forth on some of that. And you saw T.Y. Hilton put a statement out yesterday about how he said, "Please don't ask me if I'm okay, because I'm not," instead of, "We'll always hold our talks close to my heart." And I just don't know that all players connect with the owner that way. And so that's why it kind of created a little bit of the identity of the Colts, is that once these guys, and it's not just while they're here, I feel like those bonds become bigger when they're not here, or when they're no longer playing. For a lot of them, Edgerrin James, the close bond he's held with Jim Irsay over the years, 3 different players with Edgerrin, Marvin Harrison, Dwight Freeney, all had Jim Irsay present them into the Hall of Fame. That's, it's just different. It's different to have an owner invested in these guys, and not just invested in them because they're here right now and they're going to make them a lot of money together, but invested in loving them as football players and understanding them as football players. And I think that's created a sort of atmosphere here that's just different. It does feel a little bit more family football here than the other 2 teams I've covered that just had a natural distance that often happens with, rich old billionaire owners focused on business and not still loving and obsessed with football the way that Jim Irsay was.
Yeah, the fact that he was a presenter for Marvin Harrison, for Edgerrin James, and for Dwight Freeney is really, it's the most obvious example, but it's also the one that's kind of impossible to refute. Owners don't present players, like guys who go into the Hall of Fame, outside of the Colts, don't generally pick the owner, present them for the Hall of Fame. And to some degree, just this kind of going back to the last point I was talking about, I also don't know that a lot of owners have the same reverence for the Hall of Fame. To be able to even do that presentation the same way is something that matters. But like, to have that relationship, you think about you can pick anyone to present you. You can pick, like for some people it's their brother, for some people it's a coach, for some, there's all these people who are involved in their lives. For 3 players to pick Irsay, and then to hear all the stories of his influence, and paying for stuff and flying players when things go wrong, he wanted to know that he wanted to know the players, and he wanted to help them. And you hear that about the rest of the employees too. It's not just the players. I think one of the other things that sticks out is there are a lot of people who are employed by the Colts who have been there for a really long time and have been close to Irsay for a really long time. And I think there was some of that in New Orleans when I was there, but I don't think it's like that in a lot of places. I think a lot of those roles end up changing over, just as people move on or whatever. But Irsay is very, very loyal to the people that he's known for a long time and who've been with him for a long time. And they have a lot of stories about him treating them the same way that he treated the players. So I think that's another thing that's sticking out to me. Like I said, I did not know him on a personal level the way I know some of the other people I've covered here. But just from hearing people talk, this is some of the stuff that sticks out to me, in the wake of his passing.
Yeah, it really was a top-down sort of thing. And I just think like who Irsay was and who it lasted for so long here and had a ladder to it, building from those roles I mentioned up to the sole owner. And he was who he was with everybody, like you mentioned, to the point where it creates a personality, identity, and a culture and a franchise, even for those people maybe realize that. And one of the ways that I feel like the way I felt that the most, since I didn't have as many interactions with him as some other reporters either, is that the openness with which players would talk about any kind of their struggles That was very different to me coming here from the Lions and Bears. And we're at an age where, yes, there's advanced conversations about mental health and seeking help, especially among men, than there were decades ago. But we're also, in terms of the public eye, at a level of we're in the soundbite era, and it's been harder to get players to want to really open up on some things, and in with us at least, they have their own platforms to do it. But I really noticed that when I got here, my very first day, I sit down with Kenny Moore, never met the guy before, and he's sharing about how he ran home from a football practice when he was young, crying that the big kids were going to crush him into tiny bits. And he didn't want to play this game until finally someone convinced him to give it a try as a high school senior. And that he said he still lives with that doubt every day. I've had moments like, Michael Pittman Jr. sharing about when he was bullied as a kid for stuttering and how football became his way to get back at the bullies. Ryan Kelly's one you mentioned, that was one of the more powerful moments when he, shared so openly about losing his daughter, Mary Kate, right as she was born. These are things that in other places, I just feel like players have held that a little bit closer to the vest. Not that you never got them to open up, but it was a lot more rare. And here it just kind of felt like there's something in the culture that is allowed them to find strength in vulnerability. And I don't think that's a coincidence when you also consider like their public relations staff very much pushes them to share those things. They have a general manager who's about as expressive and emotional as anybody in the sport. And then their owner is like that in his own ways and actually has, scars to share in ways that a lot of billionaires born into being billionaires do not. And so whether that's the people that Jim Irsay has looked to surround himself with, whether that's the interactions he's had with them, or whether that's him serving as a model in the way he's talked so openly and allowed them to open it up. I've got to tell some amazing stories just over the past 4 years here that I think I wouldn't have with other teams that don't put mental health, vulnerability, and being open and honest with yourself and the public in the forefront the way that this one has. And so that's what I'll always take away from the Jim Irsay era that I got to see was that he kind of went out still as authentically and involved as he could have been. And it's the trickle down effect in a way that's kind of like the franchise took over his personality, and it's interesting. It's very different. Usually you don't see an owner implement that when they're usually just in a business bean counting role.
Well, I know for a fact that a part of Braden Smith's story was that he met other players and ex-players, and he kind of said that in talking to them, he found out that not everyone responds the same way the Colts do to mental health issues like that. And I don't necessarily think Irsay is all of that, but if he doesn't set the tone with the way he handles players and the way he handles tragedy, even stuff like choosing to pay Andrew Luck when Luck retires early, is something that maybe that's not a mental health thing, but it's a signal that he cares about the players in ways that maybe other teams don't. I mean, you covered an organization that famously took money back or tried to take money back from from one of its great players who retired.
Well, the two I've covered with kind of the poster children for treating their players poorly. There's a story that came out a couple years ago about the Bears offering Olin Kreutz a job paying like $19 an hour, hoping he'd come back and work for the team. And and then the Lions, they were just at absolute war with Calvin Johnson when I was there about, asking for $1 million signing bonus back when he retired because he had a foot that they had to juice up so much with painkillers to play that he couldn't feel it in the middle of a game. And they said, you didn't earn your signing bonus, so give us $1 million back. Like, I've seen the absolute opposite of this, where it's like, that's what players often talk about when they kept saying, like, the thing that hits them getting the NFL is like how much of a business it is, because there's just you go through football teams in high school and then in college, and there's just feels like there's much more of this tribal nature to it, and you'll always be, one of the legends at the college team, going back and visiting them on the sidelines during games and being celebrated. In the NFL, a lot of their experiences are, you're here and we love you for what you can produce while you're here, and then when you're no longer of use to us, kind of get out of our lives and pay us back whatever you didn't, ultimately, go out there and earn. And so there's some franchises, the Colts aren't the only ones that do it that way. The Steelers and Cowboys and Giants are known as, they're very into their players. They have environments that players love to come back to and be celebrated in. But the Colts are right in there in that zone. And I think it's been a mix of how, that part of it, the obsession with the former players. Obviously, it can go too far sometimes here. They made one of those a head coach, and they probably shouldn't have. But I think what it does tap into two sides of Jim Irsay that always were present, which is his desire and willingness to help people, especially when they hit hard times, not forget about people, but also his love of the game itself, the history of it, the plays. And so when certain guys hit that threshold of being great players for a long time and kind of give his franchise their all. And a lot of them, a lot of the guys that go into the Ring of Honor, those kind of lifelong Colts type players, he does everything to kind of keep them in that family and keep them in that circle. And there's a fraternity here that is so much different than it was with the Bears and the Lions, who had some amazing players, even though they haven't had great success. But like the Lions had a run with Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson, where both players vehemently hated the franchise when they left, to the point where they had to do it completely differently when they were trading Matthew Stafford out of fear that he was going to go the same way. The Colts don't really run into that because for so many years they've done it one way consistently, and the players see that, and that way it starts with the owner. And I think that's why you're seeing so many reach out and express their remorse and sympathies and memories about Irsay now that he's gone.
From a football standpoint, from an on-field product standpoint, I think there are a lot of fans who would say that maybe that has been a detriment. And I think there's been some easy things to point to, in terms of GMs and coaches who've gotten more chances than maybe the fan base would have liked. The idea to bring back Jeff Saturday, was one that falls into that. I think though, that death has a way of sort of crystallizing the personal versus the professional for all of us. Mm-hmm. And if I don't know, I don't necessarily think like that it's the worst thing if your mistakes came out of loyalty or belief in people. I think it's a lot worse if your mistakes come out of lack of feeling, for human beings. And so I think, this, I don't know, that maybe feels like it's a little bit too, it maybe feels like some listeners are going to go, that's a little bit too idealistic or whatever. But I just really think that death sort of crystallizes that stuff. And as much as the impact he had on the city from a football standpoint and keeping combine here and, making Indianapolis into a major city in the NFL, like the stuff that people are talking about in the immediate 24 hours after his death is less about what he meant to the football and more about what he meant to individuals and the community. And that's probably a good thing.
Yeah,
in the ultimate grand scheme of things, it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's that ledger that we all kind of face in our lives. A lot of us do, when you chase certain passions, career paths. You can be. It's like, who are you remembered along the way? There's a line between chasing success to a win at all cost level and just using every person you encounter as the next step to achieving more. Or you can also build some bonds along the way and play a little bit of both. And I think Jim Irsay played a little bit of both. I mean, you certainly can't say that he didn't have success, at times in his ownership when they won a Super Bowl and they went to another and they had all those, division championships and the way they went toe to toe as a, with the Patriots and Steelers for 15 years there in the AFC. Certainly there were moments that were not good. But I would say that like a lot of the stuff that, like you mentioned, that has become a detriment at times, his loyalty hurting the football team. I think a lot of that happened just at the end. So it's like it went a little too far. They were applying it in the wrong era, I guess. Like for so long when they kept the band together, when it was Peyton Manning and Andrew Luck and, stars at all these premium positions who were going to the Hall of Fame, like that culture was everything and let them be this kind of stable force. Late in time when you're applying that run it back, keep everything in house approach to a team that doesn't win, that doesn't have that quarterback, that doesn't have premium skill players that are great, that doesn't really have Hall of Fame talent. I think this team has one Hall of Famer right now in Quentin Nelson. To apply that same standard so extremely in that way hurt them. But to me, that's like if you're going to take it just in a football or like a sports success mind frame, that's what happens to people in sports is like sometimes they just fade. Their strengths don't work the same anymore. Matt Ryan was great until he didn't have an arm to throw with anymore, and he wasn't as good. And those guys and they hold on a little too long. And I think that was some of the frustration with Jim Irsay was that with fans with Jim Irsay is like by 2022 you could see like this guy isn't as sharp as he used to be. He doesn't his methods aren't fitting this team like they would have in the Peyton Manning era. This past couple of years, run it back. That does not fit where they are and trying to make. But like it's just like he held on a long time. He held on to the very end, and that's the way he wanted to do it. But that happens in sports all the time. I think the hardest thing for people who get so invested and obsessed is to finally walk away from that. And we see that happen all the time. We saw Tom Brady retire, come out of football, against everything he had in his personal life to go chase that again and then be very mediocre for one more season when he could have just gone out on top like that. That part happens all the time. So I think, but the difference is like once it's over, once you look back on it, I think you remember the big picture a lot more than the end. And you can understand why some people and philosophies and processes just age and not for the better. But like you look back on the career of Tom Brady, you look back at the career of Matt Ryan, people are going to remember the peak and the longevity more than the end. That's what I think is happening with Jim Irsay and is going to happen is that you could hyper focus on just some of the goofy, off-field moments and sound bites at the end and the way that they just ran it back and didn't really go for it these past few years in Jeff Saturday. And that's certainly part of the history. It's just a small part of the big picture. And the big picture is 2.5 decades as an owner and decades upon decades of doing it between Baltimore and Indianapolis. And he's created the Indianapolis Colts. I think that's what will be remembered the most.
We haven't had necessarily an official announcement. The expectation is that Carly Irsay Gordon will take over the football side. She's the one who took over in 2014. She's the one that's very visible at practices with a notebook in hand. She wears a headset on the sidelines as she learns the football side in preparation for this day that has now come. Kalen Jackson has run the philanthropy, kicking the stigma, community outreach for a while now, and then Casey Foyt is her role with the team is a little bit less front facing, but that's the expectation. We don't have necessarily an official announcement to that effect yet. I don't think that we know a lot about how this changes things for the Colts yet. And I kind of think it'd be irresponsible to guess. We're going to find that out in the days to come. Like this is the day after his passing, the family and the organization are grieving. I mean, that's, from a top down standpoint, I know the organization is grieving. And at some point there'll be the time to move on and figure out what this means for the franchise and the football going forward. I just don't think we know yet. We don't know enough about Carly's thoughts on the franchise, Kaylin's thoughts on the franchise, what they see for the future. That's stuff we're going to find out at some point in the future, in the coming days.
Yeah, it's going to be the talking point as we're kind of in the memory stage right now, since it's so fresh. But we're going to move into more of the future looking football sense as time goes out. So it makes it different than a lot of these situations. Is usually that's been more fleshed out. There's usually owners have set up some version of a transfer of power. When the Lions had Martha Ford is still around, but she was in her upper 90s, and they decided to transfer ownership to Shayla Ford Hamp and do it that way. The Bears, they lost Virginia McCaskey just a couple of years ago, but they had already empowered George McCaskey, her son, to be the front-facing chairman. Usually these things have answers spelled out a little bit more, and that's what I'm getting at with Jim Irsay. Is like, you want to hold on to the very end. This is his team, and he was gonna die running it, and did. So what that does now is that's part of that seismic shift we feel is like there's a big question of what now. We haven't thought enough or talked enough or written enough about what's next because it hasn't been fleshed out, but that's going to be conversation moving forward, and we're about there now.
I think that's it for my initial reactions. There's a conversation around the mental health that involves Irsay's history of addiction, and some of the stuff that's happened. A lot of that informs his Kicking the Stigma stuff over the last couple of years. I would say, some of the stuff written by Greg Doyle over the years, I would point you to, in terms of getting a window into some of that stuff. I do think I would say that, it maybe drew more of the focus than it should have, from certain segments of the fan base over the last couple of years. But it also informed a lot of what he did in terms of Kicking the Stigma. When he spoke about Kicking the Stigma, and that was for all mental health issues, but he was always adamant to include addiction and substance abuse as an illness in those efforts. So I think that's one of the other things that stuck out. We kind of wrote about that in several places. But yeah, it is going to be a period of remembering for a while. Like I said, we don't know exactly what it holds for the future. And it's not really time to find out yet. We'll find out in due time, and we'll kind of cross that bridge when we come to it.
Yep.
For the IndyStar, this has been Joel Erickson and Nate Atkins. That's Colts Cover-2 podcast. Just take everything in, from us and from others, from people who like, I thought we didn't mention this earlier, but Pat McAfee had a really, really interesting post on Irsay, and how he handled McAfee's surprise retirement. There's going to be more stuff like that coming out. There's lots of players talking. I think that you get a chance to remember those 40 years through all those eyes and all that stuff coming out right now. So Heart goes out to the Irsay family, to the Colts organization, everyone who's grieving right now in the wake of the passing of Jim Irsay. For the Colts Cover-2 podcast, we will talk to you soon.